welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My co-host from the library today, actually, I should have let you start.
I'm Christine Belling. I'm the Syosset Library Director.
And we're really excited for the guest we have today. Christine and I listen to different podcasts, and every now and then I'll be like throwing out names of, podcasts that I think are very interesting. And I'll say to Christine, do you listen to this? Because it's phenomenal. And Noble Blood with Dana Schwartz was just one of those where we were talking and you were like, yes, that's so interesting. So without any further ado, please tell everybody who you are, our special guest, and what you do.
Oh, thank you so much. That means so much to me. My name is Dana Schwartz. I host the podcast Noble Blood, which is a history podcast where I sort of research and script stories about fascinating nobles from history and just weird things from their lives, murder mysteries or affairs or events that maybe aren't covered in history books. And outside of that, I'm a TV writer and an author, and my next book, Anatomy, a Love Story, is coming out in February 2022.
And it takes place in Edinburgh, right?
Yeah, which I'm obsessed with. I was inspired to write anatomy because I had a fellowship in Edinburgh, right outside Edinburgh, in an actual castle for a month. It was unbelievable.
That sounds like a dream job.
It truly was.
So Noble Blood is just so interesting. There are things like you will talk about people who I've heard about, and then you'll talk about people who I've never heard about, and you wonder why you haven't. First of all, how did this all begin? And I'd love to know how you decide where your focus is going to lie.
Yeah, that's a great question. It began just because of an obsession with history on my part. I think learning about history sort of satisfies my true crime celebrity gossip itch. There's always that tiny part of me that wants to know oh, who is Angelina Jolie dating now? Or this same part of you that is weirdly drawn to true crime stories, but that was never really my speed. And so I feel like from the time I was in college, I've just been sort of obsessed with history, but it was never anything I could do in my career. I was a writer, but not a historian. And that wasn't the direction I wanted to take my career in. And then working with Aaron Mahnke, who's this amazing podcast creator who created Lore and so many other podcasts, he's the one that helped me realize oh no, this fascination where you just love to talk about history and want to tell all your friends about the weird thing you just read, this can be a real podcast with iHeartRadio. And so Aaron and I worked together and made it a real thing. And so, every episode is about a half hour long, and it's just fully researched, fully scripted. And I just tell a weird story that I found fascinating. And your second question was how I find the stories or how I decide. And I think it's always the stories that naturally I'm oh, this is unbelievable. I want to write 15 pages about this, because that's usually how long the scripts end up being. So I think if I'm interested enough to do the research, people will be interested enough to listen. And I find that research begets more stories. So the more I research and the more I dig in for one episode, that will bring me to ideas for 3 other episodes more often than not. So I just keep a running list going with my amazing research assistant, Hannah, who I started working with about halfway through our run, when I was oh, this is so much work and I have a full-time job.
As a librarian, it's so exciting to hear people get excited about research and then turn their love of blurting out weird facts into a career.
That's exactly what it is. It's I feel like a professional busybody.
Dana, I want to say that, one of the things that certainly attracted me to your podcast or to Noble Blood, and I forget like exactly how I came across it, but like your voice is fantastic
Thank you so much.
in telling these stories. So, it's to me, I think it's a combination of the writing and your voice. It's like your tone and inflection as you're telling these stories, which, they're really very interesting. And I really have a bunch of questions now based on everything that you've said so far, which is really just in a few minutes. But, I really am so like, how long does it take you to research for one episode? Like if it's a 30-minute episode, and I know you've had like a part 1, part 2.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of curious how long that takes, because there is so much information to sift through, and finding that authoritative research and what's real and what's not. And I know you had a recent episode where you were saying that there's all different information about this person, trying to find the truth, or what is likely to be the truth and what is known about this particular person.
Yeah, unfortunately, as I'm sure you know as historians, sometimes the historical record, we're missing pieces and we may never find them out, and we just have to live with that. Or, some amazing historian will go out and find something that we didn't know existed. But it takes a lot of work. I think I wish it could be a weekly podcast, or I wish episodes could be longer. But as of now, I do a half-hour episode every other week because the podcasting isn't my full-time job. And it takes me, I would say, about a week of, if, every episode is every 2 weeks, I would say I spend like a week on research and then a week on writing. And the research process has become a lot more cohesive since I started working with my research assistant. She's an amazing PhD candidate at Stanford now in history. And she works together to like pull the primary sources and books that I need. So then I'm just, have my reading in front of me, and I don't need to do quite as much work to find the important information. But yeah, usually I read through this like 150 page packet, take the important stuff, and then underline or highlight the missing pieces that I think I need to go back and research further. I mean, every episode is different. Someone like King Henry VIII, it's like sifting through, and because we know what he ate for breakfast, it's like trying to figure out what is important and what isn't. Whereas some of these lesser known historical figures, it's just trying to cut away the I was going to use profane language, but just the garbage that a lot of like internet blogs repeat, and a lot of like even encyclopedias, sometimes like older things just aren't updated with modern information. And so I sort of take it upon myself to go back and double check everything and just make sure that the information that I'm bringing to my listeners, I might make errors, but everything is to the best of my full knowledge and research ability.
I think one of the things that I like about the podcast also is how you're able to sift through so much, like in terms of like details and history, but you kind of like go straight down the middle, like you pick an angle and you figure out a way to tell that story, and in a way that's like accessible.
Thank you.
I think that oftentimes historical figures, there are details and there's this thing and that thing, but you really just kind of like brush, the ancillary things aside, and, just kind of, pick a story. And I think that part must be challenging too. Like, which part of this person's life do I go with? And even which details to leave out, because you're trying to tell either a portion of someone's life or their entire life in a short period of time. And that must be challenging, where you're like, I think the listener will like this the best, or even taking some of those details and kind of, like I said, I guess before when I said making it a little like accessible, or, I would say like, oh, you kind of dumbed it down, like for someone like me, that I can understand what's going on and who these people are and where they lived. And, I don't know, the way you put it into context for us now, I think is fantastic.
It's
Thank you.
addictively consumable is what I would say. Like, you know, when you're reading book reviews and somebody says it's readable, sometimes I'm not really sure if that's supposed to be like a knock on the reader, be like, you know, even you could read this.
Yeah, it's readable.
But I get that it's like, it's something like, it doesn't feel like it's trying to inflate itself. It feels like it's able to convey the message in a way that's going to make you want more.
I thank you so much. That's really the goal. I think so much of history, or so much of young kids today, are turned off of history because they think of it as dry and boring. And I think it's so important to remember that these were real people that had incredible and strange things happen to them. There are orgies and murders and love triangles, just wild things happening to all these individuals. And so my goal is always to tell these stories in ways that are, I think, accessible to people who don't think they're interested in history. You don't have to be interested in history, you just have to be interested in stories. And I think coming from the book and television world has helped me structure those stories, helped me, like, I look at each historical figure episode and I think, like, what is the 3-act structure here? You know, how would I structure this if it was an episode of television?
Yeah, and you know, when you talk about what some of these people have been through, I think that also is so fascinating, because think of like celebrity life now, and like we have the internet and we have television, but yet like, and how that's how we learn about these things. But all these people, you know, these historical noble figures, they partied hard sometimes.
I mean,
they did all these things.
Yeah,
and you're like,
the recent
really, they weren't so proper then.
The Lovers and La Malade was like, blew my mind in so many ways.
That one blew my mind too. That was so much. That episode was maybe the most things, because every time I read a source and it sounds unbelievable, I highlight it and like have to go back and find the primary source to be like, okay, I don't believe this. That episode, which is about an opera singer who sort of lived this insane libertine lifestyle throughout Paris, I think that was the episode I had to check the most things to be like, did this actually happen? Did this actually happen? Yeah, but it turns out it did.
Like, I mean, you feel like this would be a comic book character, this sword fighting bisexual opera singer, who, like, somebody insulted her and she challenged them to a duel, and what, that happens in real life? Crazy.
Yeah. Only her, it only happened the one time.
But then you have people like Emperor Norton, who
Norton in San Francisco,
who has been depicted in other like fiction media before. Like Christopher Moore, I believe, has him as a character in some of his vampire stories. And I didn't realize that he was a real person until I was reading this book and I'm explaining it to my husband, and he's like, oh yeah, that was based on a real person. And your episode about him was delightful as well. But he wasn't exactly noble blood, and you played with that.
I think that was my April Fool's episode. So that's how I snuck it in there. Usually I do try to keep the figures that I talk about strictly noble blood or titled, because otherwise I could, if I don't limit myself, there's just too many people I could talk about. That's just infinite. But Emperor Norton is so fun to me that it felt like sneaking him in for April Fool's was a worthwhile exception.
So what's your writing process like? So you have all this information. How do you go about putting it all together in a script?
I start with an outline. I think the same process that I would do for a book or a TV show episode is I read all the information once, just read it all through to have it in my head, read it again, taking notes, and then I outline it basically into like, okay, what's the part of the story that's going to be an introduction? What's the part that's, the beginning, the middle, the end, and what's the epilogue? And then from there, I just sort of shut the world out, close my bedroom door, and just type for as long as I can, and then go back and edit.
Like, how long does that usually take? Because, when you have like a podcasting schedule, you're like, but you're doing other projects, like you just
Yeah.
wrote a book, and it's like, well, how do you fit all these things in,
Yeah. I'm very busy. I think the way to do it is knowing that a podcast episode is never done. It's like the show's not done. It's on because it's airtime. Like the podcast episodes are never done, but they're done because I need to record. So I think the trick is knowing when to cut myself off. But no, I take the 2 weeks. I probably spend 2 weeks on each episode.
And did you ever do any acting training or voice acting? Because as Christine mentioned, yeah, your voice is amazing, and
you're so sweet.
Your tone is great, and either you have trained yourself not to say in those times, or you have an amazing editor.
I think it's because I'm reading a script, right? So I write it all through, and I'm reading it. I'm not like ad-libbing it, which I wish I could do. But I thank you so much. No, I don't have voice acting training, but I think I maybe should get some, because I'm reading the audiobook of my book that's coming out in February, and I'm incredibly intimidated about that.
Yeah, audiobook narration is a big business. And I think we recently discovered this because we've been in close contact with some people at Penguin Random House, and they have connected us for the podcast, and also I think once or twice for a virtual program with people who professionally narrate audiobooks. And it is a career. Yeah.
Oh, I'm learning that it's just like hours of work, and I'm honestly like, I agreed to do it, one, because like it's my book, I'm thrilled to do it, and I think people who are a fan of my podcast or my voice might enjoy listening to it, but I am terrified, one, to go back and read the whole book, because I think it's going to take a while, and I think it's going to be very hard, but also because like I don't want to reread every word I wrote. I think that's going to be its own special circle of hell.
So, with the narration, then you're having to do other voices for characters, because that's always like an appeal for downloadable audio, which for the community that we serve, they really download a ton of audiobooks every month, but there's such an appeal for the downloadable audio that like people, it's just hearing the story, I think really it just adds to the life of the story. And here it is, like you have the podcast, you're reading your script for Noble Blood, or with Crooked Media, you're having a conversation with people. But like to read a book is like you really have to do characters, and that's different for you.
Definitely. I think I haven't started yet, so we'll see. But I think it's going to be light on the characters. I think maybe I'll just do sort of tone and inflection, but the characters are going to be limited in scope.
I know that like several audiobooks have been using multicast lately as well, but I think there really is something for following a voice from beginning to end of the story, and being what you do with the podcast. I think it's going to work very well, especially just again, like hearing what the book is about. I think it will work very well.
Thank you so much for your faith. I told my fiance that my editor told me that I might have to do a Scottish accent for one of the characters. And I think he is preemptively planning on how to break up with me out of embarrassment. So thank you for your support.
Wait, your fiance, or you're the person who's telling you that you have to do a Scottish accent?
My fiance is like, you shouldn't do a Scottish accent. It's going to be a disaster. And he's probably right.
You never know until you try.
I know. What if I'm a savant?
So were you inspired by other podcasts when you began this? I know that you have a television background, but did you listen to a lot of podcasts before you yourself decided you were going to do this?
I didn't listen to a ton of history podcasts. I of course listen to Aaron Mahnke's Lore, which is why it was so exciting that I got to work with him. I listened to Malcolm Gladwell, like Revisionist History. That's a Malcolm Gladwell podcast. And I listened to Blank Check podcast, which is like a movie podcast. So those were like my big three. And then after I started the podcast, I started listening to a new show that I've gotten to guest on a few times called You're Wrong About, which has been a lot of fun.
We've had Sarah on Turn the Page a few times.
I love Sarah. She's the best. So yeah, my podcast experience was a little limited, but deep, but limited. But I also have gotten the structure of Notable Blood, where I do like a 30-minute deep dive into a topic in a scripted way, was inspired by Lore.
So you talk about Lore. Lore was actually adapted into a television series.
Yeah.
Is there any chance of you going full circle?
I hope. I think it's partly finding the right partner for it, finding the right like vein and way to do it that's not like so much history period stuff on TV can be a little cheesy. And so it's finding a way to avoid that. I mean, my goal is to somehow hack the system into getting to travel around the world and talk about history. But we'll see if that ever happens.
Well, that would be like totally awesome if it does happen.
Yeah.
We have an amazing theater here at Syosset. So.
I love it. I'll be there.
So just wondering, so with your podcast with Crooked Media, is that something that you're also really focused on, or is that,
No,
it's
I'm
like
more of a
here and
guest on
there
that show. Yeah. My full-time job is like, I'm in a television writer's room and I have these upcoming books, and then Notable Blood keeps me on a treadmill, but then I'm lucky enough to have sort of recurring guest host roles.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I know that you've written a lot of pieces for various like publications. Is that something that you still enjoy doing? And that, is there something that inspires you to do that? Like you come across something and you're like, yeah, I'm writing something about this. And
I do. I love freelance writing. I think that's definitely taken a backseat now that I'm focused on like bigger projects. Now that I have, a few books in the pipeline that I have to write. Now I have like a daily job where I'm clocking into work for a show. I have found that it's harder to motivate myself to write after a full day of work, unsurprisingly. But when in between writers' rooms or in between books, it's always just fun to get those wheels turning and keep them moving.
Do you have a hard time reading historical fiction yourself? Like if you know something about a topic, will you not read it because you're afraid that there will be inaccuracies and you will be like, this is terrible, I can't read this anymore?
I actually kind of love it because I love being a know-it-all. Like I love watching period pieces and getting to be like, oh, that's anachronistic, because I'm just like I'm a snob and I love showing off, which is why I do a podcast. It's so fun. No, I don't read a ton of historical fiction because while I was writing Anatomy, which is historical fiction, I was worried that I would subconsciously lift things. So I like avoided, I was like, I just can't read anything, period. Because what if a sentence sticks in my head or something? Like I just didn't want that to be not a temptation, but like a thing that I would even have to worry about. And so, but now that it's done, maybe now I can pick them up. I didn't want to like get jealous or, accidentally lift things subconsciously. So I would figure it better just to avoid all of them altogether. But now I'm free.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of the authors we talk to, it's split down the middle. They'll like, if we talk to, for instance, like a thriller author, they'll say either, oh, of course I read all of my peers' books and we blurb each other and we're always in contact, or I will never read another thriller because I feel like it's going to stick in my mind and I'm going to lift something.
That's it. I think like so much of my writing is it just like is in a blob in my head. So I actually really do like to read things that are unrelated to the things I'm working on, just because it feels like a a break.
And so with the book then, and as we're talking about lifting things or not, trying to avoid doing that, like, did you find in writing the book that, like, because of your research for Noble Blood, that, you know, you may have, like, you take elements of people's lives and you're kind of like blending it into a new story with different characters?
I wrote Anatomy. It's like my favorite period. It takes place in like 1817. Now I'm like doing a bunch of like subconsciously because we were talking about it. It takes place in 1817, which I love. It takes place in Edinburgh. So even though it's like Regency era and people might associate that with Jane Austen, I feel like because it takes place in Scotland, it's like the darker, grittier cousin of Regency England. It's like the romantic poets. It's Lord Byron and Mary Shelley. And that's my favorite period. And I had so much fun.
This has been such a fun interview. I am so happy that you agreed to do this. Christy, do you have any other questions before we sign off?
You know, I don't have any more questions, but I just, you know, I only occasionally join Jessica when she's doing this. But when she said that you were being interviewed, I was like, oh, like, yeah, totally.
It's been a delight. Thank you so much. I'm genuinely so honored that you listen to the podcast and that you enjoy it. It makes my day. Librarians are my favorite people in the world. In another lifetime, I wish I am a librarian, would be a librarian.
Well, I think you have some natural librarian tendencies.
It's true.
Yeah, you were saying, oh no, I love to be a know-it-all. I was like, oh, well, really, you would fit in very well in the world of librarian.
I think I would. I'm an obsessive researcher and I love being right. This was so wonderful. If Anatomy ends up taking me on tour, I would love to meet in person and maybe do a podcast in person.
That would
be cool.
So cool. Please keep us in contact. If not, for whatever reason, please keep us on your radar for a remote interview, but in person would be amazing. Tell everybody just really quickly what the name of your book is, when it's coming out, and then if for those who don't know, where they could find you podcasting.
My book is called Anatomy, a Love Story, and it's available February 22nd, 2022. But if you want a signed copy, the LA bookstore Book Soup is doing a signed copy hub, and they'll ship them anywhere in the world. And also you can listen to my podcast, Noble Blood, anywhere podcasts, I was going to say anywhere podcasts are sold, anywhere podcasts are available, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, take your pick.
Awesome. And we'll be having Anatomy at the library. So that is, libraries will be carrying it as well. So once again, thank you so much. This was amazing. This was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. My co-host from the library is my boss.
It's been good.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a pleasure.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.